Fantastic. I'd like to say hello to everyone out there in YouTube land, Facebook land, and almost kind of whatever land that you're living in right now. It's good to be on somebody's land right now. That is for sure. So we're just so very thankful for all that's going on here today. And so we're just glad to be here, and we're thanking you for joining us on Momentum, a stewardship idea. And again, my name is Curtis Robinson, as you see there on the screen. Typically, they call me Salt, and you can't have salt without having some pepper. And so I want my man, Elder Jeffrey Healy of the Westminster Presbyterian Church. I'm salt, he's pepper. Now guess what? You can start cooking. Come on, talk to us today, Elder Healy.
Hey, Curtis, what a pleasure. We only get to spend about 7 days a week talking to each other, but every time we do, I learn something. So you make me better, and so thankful for you to share your story with the world.
Man, that's great. That is great. I had to go make the volume, make sure the volume was nice and pretty over there. But did you finish saying hi to the people?
Yeah, but I'm getting ready to introduce somebody. So let me start this. I don't know if she's not ready for this introduction. That's what I like, because we like to put her a little bit off guard just to get started. So Patty has a cousin who is an extraordinarily great friend of mine, Elaine Catano. Elaine and I play a lot of doubles together. We spend a lot of time together. I've been to Patty's house when we could, and for a number of great meetings with her incredible family. When I met Elaine and we started to get to be a little bit better friends, I thought it was important that she know a little bit about my family history. So I told her, said, my dad was born in 1924 in right outside of St. Louis, Missouri, and December 5th was his birthday. So tomorrow would have been his whatever birthday that would be, about 90 something, and he'd be 96. So 2 days after his birthday was the attack on Pearl Harbor. And I'm telling Elaine this, that I have a cousin, my dad's cousin, Leo Shin Healy, was on board USS Arizona, and he perished at 11 minutes after 8 that morning when the bomb came in and blew up the munitions. And my dad had to served, and he went over and he took life in Okinawa, which was a moral injury for him. He never got over the fact that he had to take life. So anyways, I'm sharing that story with Elaine just so she knew what this Irish kid is coming from, what his background is. And she said, Jeff, that's fascinating. She didn't know me as salt yet, or as pepper yet. And she said, that's fascinating. My mom and dad were born in 1924 also. I said, well, that's cool. She said, yeah, they were in San Francisco, and they spent the war at Topaz. They were in an internment camp. So we all come into this thing called life, and the relationships that we form are made with people with incredible stories and often very different stories from where we are. Now, I by virtue of having a great friend like Elaine, I've gotten to meet some of her family. I had the incredible pleasure 2 Thanksgivings ago, I think it was, Patty, when I came over and met you and Jerry at your beautiful home. They have an incredible library upstairs. And when we were talking about this show, I said, we've got to get another perspective. So this is Patty Iyama. She is an incredible woman, the cousin of a dear friend of mine. Patty's lineage is incredible. Her mother, Chizu, passed a couple months ago at around 98 years old. Her dad, Ernie, was phenomenal. I'm not going to tell you all of her story. I'm going to turn it over to Patty. I could talk for another hour about you, Patty, but that's not what we're here for, to hear me talk. We're here to hear your story.
Okay. First of all, I had a relative who also died during World War II. My father's parents came from Hiroshima, and they were living in Hiroshima when the bomb went off. And fortunately, Hiroshima is surrounded by mountains, and they were on the other side of the mountain, so they escaped the blast. However, an aunt went into town that day to the market, and they never heard from her again. So we don't know what happened. We assume that she was going to the center where exactly the bomb was dropped, so we figure she was probably incinerated right away, fortunately, which is better than what happened to a lot of other people. So, but that was not what informed my life. It is true that the camp experience was a very deep one for all Japanese Americans. 120,000 of us were put into camp without any trial, just on the basis of race, saying that Japanese were potential saboteurs and military. It was a military necessity, but there was never any case of sabotage that was ever, or spying that was ever brought to trial against any Japanese American. The ones who were put on trial for spying and all were all white, because of course the Japanese American would have been very conspicuous at the time trying to get any information. But my parents were very open about the camp experience. They talked with me about it a lot, and they talked about what a terrible deprivation of civil rights and civil liberties it was, and what a devastating effect it had on, especially on my grandparents, on that generation. They were the first generation of immigrants to the United States, who came over in the after the Chinese were excluded. The Japanese came over as laborers, and they were the first generation who, they were in their 50s and 60s, many of them, by the time they were put into camp. And so for them it was devastating when they got out. You could not rebuild what you had lost. Many of them lost their farms. They had been fishermen. They lost their fishing boats, their nets, all of their equipment. And they lost houses, cars, pets, even little things, well, not even little things, all their businesses too. Many of the businesses were taken over by others. For instance, there's a big fireworks company in Seattle, and they got their start by taking all of the fireworks from the Japanese Americans in the area. Ah, that's a picture of my mother behind you.
Yeah, Jesus.
She's the one who died at age 99. She was very active, and very vocal about the camp's experience, something that most Japanese Americans did not talk about at all until like the 1985, 86.
So Patty, the terrible executive order 9066 was, I guess, really enacted in March of 42. And
it came out in February of
42. But yeah, so your parents, or your, I guess it was your dad's family was down in Santa Anita, and then when did they go up to Topaz?
No, my father actually, he was born in the United States, but then he went back to Japan. His parents went back to Japan and brought him back to Japan. So he had been raised in Japan. He knew Japanese. He could read it. He could write it. But then he was eligible for the draft, and so he decided to come to the United States. So they sent him to the U.S. He came to Cal, went to school for a few years, dropped out, but he was sent to Tanforan, which at that time was a racetrack in southern San Francisco. That's where many of the people from Oakland and that area were sent. My mother she lived in Chinatown. And there were a number of Japanese families who lived in Chinatown at the time. And her father managed a hotel for single men. It was basically for Black and Chinese and Japanese, many of them sailors, and all single men hotel. And so they were sent to Santa Anita down in LA. My mother claims that their family was installed in Man of War's stall, a very famous horse.
Yeah.
She claims that they had the plaque that had his name on it outside their stall. But the whole family lived in one stall there at one time. And she said that they could, and both my parents said they could smell the horse manure all the time. It was very difficult, and they were very, very crowded, of course. I mean, one family in a horse stall is not very much room. So they stayed there for a while until Topaz and 10 other concentration camps were built around the country. Most of these camps were usually built on Indian reservations. Because that was government land, and the government could just easily build right on the land. Once Topaz was built, both my mother and father were sent there, and that's where they met, actually. And they fell in love there, and when they left camp, they were able to leave camp early. They were married in Chicago. And
so how were they allowed to leave early? And if you could tell a little bit about the actions that they were part of in Chicago, particularly the wait-ins, if you could talk about that.
Sure. My parents were in the Communist Party. And it was not unusual for many, well, I mean, it was unusual, but there were a core group of about 300 or so, I believe, Japanese Americans who were in the Communist Party. They went to New York from Chicago, and they were able to get out of camp early on student visas. My mother got out on a student visa, and I think that's how my father got out too. But neither of them were students at the time. They just were able to get out because they were younger. And they moved to Chicago, back to Chicago from New York. And my father was a machinist at General Electric. And my mother was employed at the Japanese American Resettlers Committee. A lot of Japanese Americans, when they got out of camp, instead of going to the West Coast because of the kind of conditions that they faced there, people who came back, some of them were shot at, people were beaten up, they ran into a lot of problems. And so most families decided to go back east instead. So many of them went to Chicago. And so my mother was active in the Chicago, she was the assistant director of the Chicago Resettlers Committee, which was responsible for finding housing, jobs, everything else to help the people coming out of camps. And it stayed in existence for quite a while. It became something else later. I ran into somebody who was later director of it, and he said, "Oh, the Chicago Resettlers Committee, that was a long time ago." And it was. But in Chicago, my parents were very active in a whole number of things, not only in the labor union, but also many other things. Before the civil rights movement actually got started, they were in civil rights organizations like CORE, I think, and the NAACP. And so we participated in a number of actions, such as there were, in the late 40s, early 50s, we were trying to desegregate the beaches in Chicago. The rocky beaches were reserved for black people, and the white people got the sand, the nice sandy beaches. So we were trying to desegregate the beaches, and we participated in wade-ins. And one thing that my parents told me at the time was that I could not just play on the beach. When we went on these wade-ins, I had to be watching them all the time so that at the moment's notice we could run because we would get attacked. So I forgot one time, and I was playing, I was having a great time, and all of a sudden my father came and he grabbed me and said, "Hurry up, come on, we gotta run." And we ran like crazy, and he finally had to pick me up because I wasn't running fast enough, because this whole group of racists were coming after us with bats and all sorts of other things, and we were real worried. We made it into a car. But after that, for a long time, when I went to the beach, I didn't feel like I could relax. I felt like I had to watch my parents all the time just in
Wow.
case something
Yeah.
happened. Needless to say, we were not successful in desegregating the beaches. We tried, but we weren't successful. We did other things like participated in uh, things where people were getting thrown out of their houses, eviction, and so we'd have eviction parties to try to help people who were being evicted from their homes because they couldn't pay rent. There were a number of things like that that we did. But my parents in 1956 became very disillusioned with the Communist Party. They it was a combination of things, the Khrushchev revelations that Stalin had been lying to them all this time, and had actually killed millions of people in the gulags and all. And then that they invaded Hungary, and there was a whole democratic movement in Hungary, and they invaded Hungary, the Soviet Union invaded Hungary, and ruthlessly crushed them. So the combination of events made my parents rethink their whole commitment to the Communist Party, and they left the Communist Party, moved back out here to California. And but my mom and dad continued with the kind of work they had been doing before. My mom and I, for instance, picketed Woolworths in the late 50s here on Shattuck Avenue and University, because they were not allowing black people to sit at the counter, at the lunch counter.
So you were barely a teenager.
No, I wasn't even a teenager.
Good.
So you're like a little baby, right?
I'm not trying to age you.
Baby. I was a baby in the wait-ins, but not. I was about 13, 14 maybe, and my grandmother crossed the picket line, and I was horrified. I called out to her and I said, "Oh, Bachan, how could you cross a picket line?" And she pretended like she didn't know us. We were the black sheep of the family.
Oh, okay. So Patty, I have a question. If you would allow me to ask of such, I mean, it's clear that that you have been dipped in the blood of the humanist manifesto that wants to create freedom and liberty for people. Social justice, cultural integrity. I mean, your mom is amazing. That's really clear. Whatever is written about her, I want to read it, right? As I've read this article. So what do you see today? I mean, so we fast forward,
Sure.
right? And so, I mean, you saw it. I mean, my goodness, I'm thinking about, Jeff, what I saw coming up. I mean, my God, that was beautiful. I mean, however God bless you, that to happen to you in your life at such a young age, right?
Yeah.
That's to me a blessing. So fast forward, what are your thoughts now? What windows are you looking out of today?
Okay. Well, you should know I'm a retired industrial worker. I was an oil worker for many years at Shell in Martinez.
Okay.
And the reason why I became an industrial worker was I had been at the university. I had taught the first Asian American Studies class at the University of California at Davis. I taught at Merritt College a number of on third world women, on economics of the third world, a number of things like that.
That's powerful.
But I decided that the people who could really change society, and I thought it was very important that this society is founded on greed, on profit, on trying to make money for a few, and only a few people get it. Most of us are not rich and cannot afford a lot of the things that we should be able to afford. So I feel very strongly that this society has to change, and the basis of this society has to become one of meeting people's human needs and not based on profit. And in order to do that, in order to change this society, I feel that the people who have the power to change it are industrial workers. Because as an academic, we shut down schools all over the place and it didn't make the slightest bit of difference. I mean, yes, it was good we could convince some people about the goodness of our cause, but it didn't do anything to actually change things. And what I saw is actually changing things. I was very active in the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, in the women's abortion rights movement, and a number of these different things. And later on, when I became an industrial worker, I became part of many union struggles that have happened over the years. And what I saw was that it was through organizing working people who are industrial workers in particular, who have the power to actually stop the wheels and levers of society and actually make the kinds of changes that are needed. So I still see that as the major thing that needs to happen in the United States. I think that this pandemic has exposed that we do not have a healthcare system in this country. What we have is a health-for-profit system, which does not care about working people, about the majority of people, only people who can afford their services. And that the people in the government, the ruling class who runs this country, also doesn't care about the people, and can only come up with these solutions of shutting everything down. I don't think everything needed to be shut down if we had had a healthcare system that actually worked. I look to Cuba, for instance. Cuba has the lowest per capita death rate because of this virus of any country in the world. They have had 87 deaths. And the reason why is because they have a healthcare system that's based on providing healthcare for everyone. Healthcare is considered a right. And so doctors visit people, everybody in a block, for instance. They visit them several times a week to find out how they're doing. If they are not doing well, they immediately bring them to a separate place where they are isolated. They are fed 3 meals a day. They have the doctors coming in to take care of them, and they do not miss work. Their wages are still paid to them. They did not shut down the schools. They did not shut down their jobs. They shut down some jobs because tourism, for instance, was no good anymore, and they could not get supplies because of the U.S. embargo on other level. But they would change everything over into making masks and to making the proper PPE. They kept people employed, and I think you can keep people employed coming to work if you change the conditions. For instance, meat packing plants. You could keep a meatpacking plant open, but you have to slow down the line speed. You have to have a much more space between the workers. You have to have them at least 6 feet apart. To do that cuts into the profits of the meatpacking industry, and that's why they refuse to do these simple measures that could be taken that would impact the workers and keep the workers safe. And the only people who I think will actually care about the working conditions at these plants are the workers themselves. And they're the ones who are starting to organize and say, no, we will not take these conditions. We want to have safe conditions. And that's the way forward that I see. I think we need jobs for everyone. I think there are lots of jobs that could be had if they were made available, if the government had a jobs program where they could, everyone would be employed at union wages and would do things like build more hospitals, more schools. There would be more teachers, for instance. Teaching class sizes should be small, not large. I was in classes in Chicago where there were 45 kids and we didn't have desks. We sat on the floor, because they didn't have enough even desks for us, let alone to have one teacher teaching 45 kids. That's very difficult. You really can't.
Patty, what do you think about the role of specialization and robotics, stuff like that? How do we ensure that? How do we attempt to create a casteless society in the world of specialization?
Well, I think that robotics can be very useful. They can take a lot of the things jobs that should be automated. I've had jobs where, it would have been a real blessing to have a robot doing the job. Like, for instance, I loaded airplanes. I worked on the ramp loading as a baggage handler, loading, and those bags, most of them were well over 50 pounds, and it was really difficult and most people who were ramp workers, their backs went out after 5 years. That was just, and you worked anyway with a bad back because you had to work. And
no gym memberships or anything like that? Like
no gym memberships, nothing. No. And that wouldn't have helped either because the bags were so heavy. I mean, I remember people packed their bowling balls, and anyway.
Would that be like legal today? That's like
I don't know. I don't know.
Like I put like a little syringe in there and like blow something up in a bowling ball. Wow, that's amazing.
So, but anyway.
I want Jeff to ask you another question, right? But because I know he has it, I see it on his face, but I want you to know that I must correct you with these deaths in Cuba from the COVID. But first, let me preface it with this. The United States, my dear, according to this website on the CDC, 276,000 deaths so far on this website. In Cuba, 136. All right, she was off 10. Moving on. Go ahead, Healy.
Well, yeah, Patty, I want to talk to you about before the pandemic. About once a month, I'd go over to play tennis with a group of friends, and they were friends at a little exclusive resort called San Quentin. These were the inmates that are there because of Jim Crow, because if we can put them in prison, we can take away their rights to vote. You've been directly impacted by this. I know your mom and dad were very, very influential in the passing of the reparations movement that gave 56,000. I'm sure how many Japanese received, but they got $20,000 each. What are your thoughts, and what are your thoughts on the role of reparations as a means of addressing a centuries-long, just really terrible event in our nation?
Before I get to the reparations, first of all, I wanted to say something about the prisons, because I think the prison system in this country is also for profit, is not about rehabilitating people or helping people to rehabilitate themselves. And I know firsthand because I went to prison for 30 days with the free speech movement. It was a very short period of time, but I was at Santa Rita. And I know, for instance, that the medical care is totally lacking. We had one woman who got extremely sick and they refused to call a doctor for her. We finally called our lawyers who called a doctor for her. But that was the only way she got treatment. She had a fever of 102. She was in terrible shape, and they told us that she might well have died if we hadn't gotten the doctor to her in time. But because the prisons are not set up to help rehabilitate people or to treat people as human beings, what happens is that they need to be totally redone. Just like everything else in the society, I think from the ground floor up has to be rethought and redone. Now on the reparations, my parents were very active in the fight for reparations, both of them. They would go around and speak wherever they could about what had happened to the Japanese Americans and why it should not happen again. And they were part of a whole movement that began. It began, first of all, with a congressional hearing where hundreds of Japanese spoke out for the first time about their experiences in camp and what it had meant to them. And many of them, their children, had no idea that there had even been these concentration camps, because most of them had never talked about it at home. The kids knew that their parents, whenever they would meet another Japanese American family, they would say, "What camp were you in?" And a lot of these kids, they thought, "Oh, summer camp." They just had no idea. So
yeah, let's have fun.
Yeah, right. And so anyway, the whole truth started to come out, and it became much better known that these camps had happened during World War II and what kind of impact they had had on the Japanese American community. And so there was a small group of people at the beginning who back even before this happened had said, we need to get reparations. Now the reason why they wanted reparations, they wanted an apology from the government so that that would be something that they would never do again. And we got that. Actually, Ronald Reagan signed that.
Yes, 1988.
Yeah, and then the reparations. The reason for the reparations was they said, well, this society is built on money, and if it doesn't cost them anything, they won't hesitate to do it again. But if you demand reparations and you make them pay money for it, then they may very well think twice about doing it again. That was the rationale behind asking for reparations. It was a very practical thing, but to try to make sure it didn't happen again. And there was a whole campaign that began, and it gained momentum first within the Japanese American community, and then because people were speaking about it outside of the community, they got allies and got other people to endorse the idea of both an apology and reparations. And then they lobbied senators and House of Representatives people and things like that, and were able to get it passed. But basically, the reason why I believe that the reparations passed was because of the civil rights movement. The success of the civil rights movement drove first of all, the fact that the Japanese Americans felt courageous enough to talk about what had happened in the past, and then to try to get an apology and to prevent it from happening again. They saw the success of desegregating the South, of getting rid of the Jim Crow laws, and that emboldened them to feel like they could also be successful. So I think that that was a key component of what happened at that time.
Great. I have no idea the answer to this, so it's obviously a question I shouldn't ask, but the amount was $20,000. I don't know what that is in today's dollars.
38,000.
38,000. I love the idea that by making the government pay, it changed the likelihood of that. I want to turn over to Curtis for just a moment to talk about his thoughts on reparation as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Elder Healy. And, again, Patty, just a tremendous narrative. And, to, hear you talk about reparations in such a way, and to actually see that the government said, okay, cut them a check, right, does lend some reality to this reparations piece, right? I have written several articles that have been published about reparations. I have done some reading on it, probably needs to be more extensive, no doubt. I read Ta-Nehisi Coates, his recommendations on reparations. I'll just get straight to the punch, right? Because, first of all, as I wrote in one of my essays, the first thing that reparations does is that it makes the party that's guilty understand the reality of what has happened. And when you surrender an apology, what you say is, you know what, I did it. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I accept it. I have looked at myself in the mirror. That's what I've done. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to, quote unquote, use some money to right a wrong, technically, right? I like how you brought that to the forefront. What are your thoughts on the inability of this government to create a reparations platform for African Americans as such?
Well, that goes back to right after the Civil War. They had done an experiment in the Sea Islands where they did give blacks 40 acres and a mule. And
40 acres and a mule. That's right. Yes. Freedmen's Bureau.
Yes. And they did, it was a great experiment, but then it died. And
Okay, put a pause right there. All right, so let's talk about why it died.
okay, it died because what happened was that the reason why they allowed it in the first place, and the reason why the Civil War took place in the first place, was to end slavery, because the industrialists were finding that it cramped their style to have slaves, slavery plantation economy as half of the economy of the United States. The plantation owners controlled the political part of the U.S. government for quite a while, and were able to stymie a lot of the measures that the industrialists and the capitalists needed in order to move forward. And so that was the basic reason why slavery had to go, that it cut across their ability to expand the way they needed to. So what happened was that the Civil War was fought, and a lot of it, and by the end, a lot of it was won by the freed slaves themselves, as you know, fighting in the troops.
Fighting for the North.
Yes, for the North. And
Oh, let me just, by the way, just say also, I know you did your homework, but he did, what she's talking about is when cotton ceased to become king.
yes.
So when cotton was king, King Cotton was King Cotton.
Well, yeah, and then what happened was, though,
There you
that
go.
the plantation owners tried to take it back. After the war, there was a brief period, and Grant came in and smashed them and got Reconstruction going. And then what happened was, in 1876, there was an agreement. And the agreement was that the North would pull all the federal troops out of the South and no longer enforce any of the amendments that had been passed in terms of the voting rights of black people, et cetera, abandoning the Freedmen's Bureaus, everything else. And the reason why they did this was because I believe that the industrial capitalists decided that they had smashed the political power of the plantation aristocracy, were able to move forward on the fronts that they needed to, and so they didn't care what happened. And so they were able to get this compromise, and as soon as the federal troops were pulled out of the South, of course, that was the signal for the former plantation aristocracy to come back in and institute Jim Crow, do all of these other things, and that's what happened. And
Right.
So what's been sort of fun's the wrong word, and words have incredible power. To hear your comments, Patty, about families coming in. What camp did you live in? And for us to think of it that way, there's a very impactful word that is, it's just, if we were to promise to never use the word plantation again, but instead call it what it was, now it's slave camps. I think if we call them slave camps, the allure of the South would be really put to the test. Those were slave camps. They were not plantations.
sure.
Well, the plantation piece gives them the clarity of knowledge to call it a business enterprise. And I get that. W.E.B. Du Bois says that Black Reconstruction was a horrible failure. It was a beautiful failure, actually, is what he actually said. Because as Patty has alliterated so greatly and historically, it cramped the style of the Northern industrialists. And so I think you take that and then you put into the play, into the cultural grind, the other myths about Blackness, right? You know, when you look at, how the Roman government, itself. I mean, when we start talking about caste and class, classism in America, I mean, that only emboldens slavery. That's what it does. No, they're supposed to be that way. They're born that way. I'm thinking like this, honestly. Well, let's take care of the Asians because there's not so many of them, and we don't have to go back that far. But if we go back that far with African Americans, There's going to be some digging that's going to happen. As a matter of fact, we might even find some Irish people that we might have to pay reparations to, because there's evidence that in 1629, what was unearthed in Virginia were some skeletons of some young white people. And when they did an autopsy, they saw that they had led a very horrible life. They had been beaten, and there was very strong indication that they came over on the first exploration ships when your boy Cromwell, I call him your boy, Jeffrey. I know he's not really your boy, but when Cromwell, went on this genocidal rampage in England and tried to get rid of all the Irish people, killed all the Irish men, and then sent the women and kids to America on these expedition trips, right? And so they enslaved them, right? And so if we go back far enough, we'll find some eggs that have not been hatched before. Will make everybody go like,
and you know how, what I understand, the way that the Irish, and Curtis and I have talked about my Irishness many times. We were, we basically were thrown out of Ireland and came over here, but the Irish were taxed on their homes. It wasn't the square footage of the home. It wasn't the size of the lot. It was how many windows they had and how much of the king's sunlight was being used.
That's almost like the tax that was raised on the Chinese in Chinatown in San Francisco, where they were taxed for the air that they breathed.
Oh man, come on. How long ago was that?
That was back in 1870.
Okay, he said 18. That's good enough for me. That's pretty, that's like yesterday.
Well, it was quite amazing. And they did it by, where you lived. And they taxed you by the amount of air that you had in wherever you lived. And of course, many of them were very crowded together. So anyway, but that's like that kind of a tax.
Well, my great grandfather, talking about economics and the like, Southern Illinois, 1862, went to war for the North in lieu of a wealthy man's son. Now we send our kids to college so they get deferments. Then you could pay, it was $300, which was a lot of money.
That was
but that's how he got enlisted into the Union Army. He used that money to put himself through medical school, which leads to the next part. The money comes, how do we ensure that this equity helps to grow towards creating safety? And I'm talking about wealth in as far as safety, not as far as having more money as somebody else. What are your thoughts on how do we get the next generation to buy in?
Well, I'm not quite sure I understand your question, because what I'm talking about is there would have to be a very different society created where people would think in solidarity with other people, that they would think about other people's welfare as well as their own. Now, this will not be true for everyone. I'm no Pollyanna. I don't believe that everyone will be unselfish or anything like that. But most people, I think, can be. And I've seen it in fights that I've been in before, where people think, for instance, I'll tell you something. I was in the Eastern Airlines strike, and back in the 89, 90, 91 era. And the people there had, in New York at LaGuardia, had not ever heard of Nelson Mandela before the strike. They had not heard of a lot of things before the strike. The strike opened up the world to them because they started looking for allies, and they started looking to see what other people might be interested in backing them and in helping them. And they became aware of Nelson Mandela. And so I happened to be there on the day that Nelson Mandela was released from prison. And we were watching it on TV. And there were tears running down the faces of these strikers, most of whom were white. And I asked them, "Why are you crying?" And they said, "This is a man who is so principled, and he is just like us, and he stood up for what he believed in, and he stood there for 26 years or however many years he took it." And I hope I'm as great as, I'm as good as he is. But the fact that they could empathize at that point in time with somebody who they had never heard of, even a year before, that it shows what can happen to people. People change. They don't remain the same. That's another thing that I have found. You can change and you can be different. And so I think that if we fight together, we will be able to create a different kind of society than what we have now, where people will not think first about making money. They will not think first about me, me, me. I mean, this is what the pandemic has shown, that we are all left on our own. You decide for yourself whether you wear a mask. You decide for yourself whether you socially distance. You decide for yourself whether you feel comfortable traveling on Thanksgiving. It's not like your masks are provided for you, for instance. That would have been one thing to do. You know, I mean, it's like you just have to figure out for yourself what the science is and how you do. So a society like that is not what I'm thinking the next generation will want. I think the next generation of kids is going to want to have something that's much more inclusive and not divided like this. And I believe there are classes here in the United States. We've been taught there are no classes, but it seems more and more obvious that there are, when less than 1% of the population owns more wealth than 80% of the rest of us. I mean, it's just unbelievable, the gap in the standard of living of people in this society, and it's because of class. It's not big, and I believe that other things that have happened. For instance, I believe that there's a lot less racism now than there has ever been in the United States. I think that it was shown by the depth and the breadth of the protests around Floyd, around the death of Floyd. The fact that it went to every little city, even in rural towns, people were protesting. They were horrified at seeing this kind of brutality and protested against it. And I think this would not have been possible 20 years ago. I don't think we would have seen anything like this 20 years ago. So I think it shows the breakdown in what the rulers have used to keep us divided. They've used all sorts of different weapons. They've used religion, they've used race, they've used gender, they used immigration status, they use unemployed versus employed. They use every kind of category they can think of to keep us divided, so that we don't realize if we unite together, we are strong and we can accomplish a great deal. But anyway.
Yeah, that's a great statement. And I've been ribbing Healy lately, asking him these extremely difficult questions, right? Thinking that he has an answer for him, and I know he doesn't. I don't have an answer for him either, right? Like, for instance, you talk about the 1%, right? Did you know that in 150 CE, that the ruling class of the Roman Empire owned 16% of everything? And fast forward 2020 CE, the ruling class now owns 40% of everything. And it's still 1% at the top and 99% at the bottom. And I believe that one of the reasons that we cannot get to the classism discussion, which is what we need to get to, say what you want about Cuba, everybody there goes to college for free, have a very informed populace. The term we talk about, paideia, Healy, is happening there, right? Even in Brazil, I think the cost of a undergraduate degree is free, right? And so you have an educated populace. So I'm not surprised that, in Cuba, the numbers are down, because people are kind of taught to think and to process. So with that said, we just have a few minutes left. And Jeff, man, thank you so much, man, for bringing Patty on. And why don't you go ahead and just, do what you do, man.
You want me to give the, Patty, we often We close with an editorial. Before we do that, I'd like, if there's anything you'd like to add to the discussion before I spend a couple minutes on an editorial I wrote, we want to give you the floor.
I thought it was very good.
Awesome.
You guys let me say what I think and ask questions about things, and I hope I answered what you were asking.
Man, I wish we had another hour to talk because, man, you gave me some notes.
You were incredible, and Elaine said you would be. I had high expectations. You blew them away. You're even better than I could have imagined. So I'm gonna take the floor here for just a moment and talk about something that's tangential to what we talked about today, and hopefully it'll come together near the end. And Curtis and I are on a call every Friday morning, and part of the call is a doctor in the city that runs emergency medical services for Zuckerberg San Francisco Hospital. He's the guy that runs it, so he's really a big part of this. So, vaccines are supposed to start being distributed in the next couple of weeks. We're fortunate to live in this very wealthy nation. We're a first world nation. We're the last in this nation. Will likely be near the top in many other nations insofar as economics, but we argue about what place we're going to be in line when the vaccines come out. Many nations don't even know if they're going to have a line to stand in. So this travesty about the rich controlling everything. Triage is going to be very important in this nation. Autonomy is going to be important. Autonomy meaning if I don't want to take this, I shouldn't have to, but that's going to have to be adjudicated also, because there's the greater good to the society if you don't take it. What's that cost going to be? I keep falling back. I was thinking the last couple of days about 9/11. And there was an author that I read a number of years ago that talked about the different groups of people that whose real character were displayed in the towers when they fell. There were the people that were walking down the towers, down the stairwell in darkness, in fear, and they were orderly. Now, they didn't know if that orderliness was going to save them, but they knew it was going to save more. There were people going down the steps that cared about me and me only. They were shoving people out of the way. It's all about me, all about me, all about me. There were people that were disabled that had to stay up in the offices knowing that they couldn't come down. There were people that stayed up in the offices with them that could have walked down. And then there were people walking up the steps to help. I've been thinking about Kitty Genovese. This was the lady in 1964 in New York City, was stabbed to death, and people watched and did nothing to help. I think about the police and firefighters observing the regulations that kept them from going into the water off Robert W. Crown Memorial Park in 2011 when Raymond Zach chose to commit suicide by drowning. They weren't going to break the rules. They didn't go in. I think about the Time Machine movie, that great movie back in 1960. H.G. Wells, played by Rob Taylor, dives into the water to pull out Weena, Yvette Mimieux, from the river while the Eloys watched, unmoved by her dilemma. Anyway, I'm still concerned, terribly concerned, where we allow our servant politicians to rule rather than to serve. Amen. Curtis, you're muted.
Can't hear you.
I'm like, excellent. I'm going, amen. All right. So thank you, my friend, so much for that great editorial piece. And again, Patty, it's been a pleasure. Love your rap. Hope to get a chance to sit and talk with you again. Looking forward to sharing a cup of coffee and some tea, hanging out there with you and Jeffrey, so we can sit up there and we can learn more about this great narrative that you have. So again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for Momentum, a stewardship idea, and we'll see you next Friday at 1:00. Peace, and we're out of here. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Patty.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patty.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
for having me.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey,
All right, Bar. Good show, man.
he-
I hate when I do that mute stuff, man. I be
that's okay.
like, dude, such an amateur. Great piece, man. I love you. It's been a rough week, man, but it's been a great week.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sweating. Woo. Been working this week.
I think that went well. And the editorial, I hopefully I looked into the screen.
No, it was good, man. No, you did. You was relaxed. It was good. And we're gonna get it spiffed up and we're gonna nod it. We're gonna get it done. All right, my man.
Thanks. Cheers.
I love you, man. Have a great one. Talk to you soon.